At the age of 50, Cristian Castro no longer speaks like a pop idol guarding a legacy. He speaks like a man who has survived it. What emerged from that leaked conversation was not a scandal engineered for attention, but a quiet rupture in the unspoken code of the entertainment industry. The rule that says conflicts must be disguised as smiles and pain must be edited out of the narrative. Cristian did not raise his voice, did not accuse with rage, did not seek redemption through tears. He simply named. And in doing so, he exposed something far deeper than personal feuds. The emotional cost of growing up, performing, and aging inside a system that rewards perfection and punishes vulnerability. From the beginning, Cristian framed his disillusionment not around rivalry, but around fear. Fear of losing relevance, fear of displeasing fans, fear of appearing human. In his view, many artists he encountered were not driven by music anymore, but by anxiety, constantly calculating how to protect their image, their status, their myth. That fear, he suggested, hollowed them out. It turned colleagues into competitors, rehearsals into negotiations, and stages into battlegrounds where ego mattered more than harmony. When Cristian finally decided to speak, it was not because he wanted revenge, but because he no longer saw the point in carrying other people's masks on his own face. The first name on his list, Pablo Montero, represents this fracture between discipline and indulgence. Their conflict did not explode publicly. It grew in silence backstage, in late arrivals, skipped rehearsals, and subtle acts of dominance disguised as spontaneity. For Cristian, music has always been tied to rigor, to respect for timing, for preparation, for the audience. What he perceived in Pablo was the opposite. A reliance on charisma to excuse disorder, an attitude that treated the stage as a place to conquer rather than to serve. The infamous Monterrey incident, where Pablo stepped onto the stage ahead of schedule and sang what was meant to be Cristian's closing moment, was not, in Cristian's eyes, a mistake. It was a statement. From that point on, distance replaced dialogue. Refusals replaced explanations. Cristian chose absence over compromise, even when it cost him lucrative projects. In his moral framework, sharing a stage without mutual respect was not professionalism. It was surrender. With Lucero, the wound was quieter and more personal. There was no chaos, no intoxication, no shouting. There was power. Media power. Institutional backing. A single comment, carefully phrased and publicly delivered, cut deeper than any open insult. When she suggested that Cristian's emotional intensity bordered on drama, she did so with a smile that television loves and nuance rarely survives. Cristian never answered her publicly. He did not need to. In private, that sentence redefined their relationship forever. To him, it was not criticism but exposure. A colleague choosing diplomacy over empathy, optics over truth. The fact that he later refused substantial offers simply to avoid sitting on the same judging panel reveals the depth of that disappointment. This was not hatred. It was the collapse of an expectation. Pedro Fernandez embodies yet another kind of fracture, the slow burn of comparison. Two child stars. Two legacies. Two divergent philosophies. Cristian pursued vocal exploration and emotional risk, while Pedro remained anchored in a carefully curated tradition. When Pedro accepted an award with a speech that praised authenticity while implicitly questioning fabrication, Cristian heard more than rhetoric. He heard judgment. The loss of a role Cristian believed was once his only reinforced a familiar sensation. Being quietly replaced, never confronted, never acknowledged. The distance between them was not explosive, but persistent, marked by avoided seats, absent photographs, and unspoken decisions. In all these cases, the pattern is clear. Cristian Castro is not cataloging enemies. He is tracing boundaries. Each name corresponds to a moment where he felt something essential was violated. Respect, sincerity, or emotional truth. His story in this first chapter is not about bitterness, but about erosion. About how repeated compromises, even small ones, eventually demand a reckoning. And at 50, Cristian chose clarity over comfort, honesty over harmony, and silence over performance. If the earlier fractures in Cristian Castro's story revolve around colleagues and professional values, the next rupture cuts closer to the bone, because it reveals how competition can hide behind elegance, and how love can coexist with control. With Cheyenne, the conflict was never loud enough to become tabloid material, yet sharp enough to leave a permanent scar. On the surface, Cheyenne represented everything the industry celebrates: discipline, charm, reliability, and an image polished to the point of being untouchable. He was the artist who never stumbled, never broke character, never allowed the machinery behind him to show. Cristian, by contrast, carried his emotions openly. His voice cracked when it needed to. His presence was raw, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes excessive. That difference was not merely stylistic. For Cristian, it was philosophical. Their shared promotional tour in the late 1990s placed them side by side in a setting designed to manufacture unity. To the audience, they were presented as equals, as two icons of Latin pop masculinity sharing the same spotlight. Backstage, however, the atmosphere told a different story. Small technical decisions became symbolic acts. Sound checks, microphone levels, and staging order stopped being neutral details and turned into signals of hierarchy. When Cristian realized that Cheyenne's microphone had been subtly adjusted to dominate the mix, he interpreted it not as caution, but as calculation. There was no argument, no confrontation. Cristian withdrew, demanded equal conditions, and performed his set without incident. Yet something fundamental shifted that night. For Cristian, music is inseparable from intention. The idea that sound could be manipulated to manufacture superiority felt like a betrayal of the unspoken ethics of performance. His decision to walk off stage when asked to improvise together was not impulsive defiance, but refusal. Refusal to play along with an illusion of harmony he did not believe in. The press labeled him difficult. The narrative framed him as temperamental. But behind the curtains, those who witnessed the tension understood that this was not about ego, but about authenticity. Years later, Cristian would describe Cheyenne as someone who sings from strategy rather than from the wound. That distinction matters because for Cristian, the wound is not weakness. It is the source. Their rivalry resurfaced in moments of public recognition, particularly when awards were involved. When Cheyenne won where Cristian was nominated, the absence of applause spoke louder than outrage. Cristian's stillness, captured by cameras trained to detect reaction, became its own statement. In his mind, the industry rewarded precision and consistency over emotional risk. He did not resent Cheyenne's success, but he rejected what that success symbolized. Popularity achieved without exposure, connection without vulnerability, performance without sacrifice. In one of their final shared appearances, a tribute to Jose, the contrast was unmistakable. Cristian sang as if reliving his own losses. Cheyenne smiled flawlessly. For many viewers, both performances were professional. For Cristian, only one was honest. Yet none of these rivalries, however painful, compares to the most complex name on his list. The one that cannot be reduced to artistic disagreement or industry politics. Veronica Castro is not merely a figure in Cristian's life. She is the origin of it. His mother, his first manager, his protector, and in his words, the architect of both his rise and his inner fracture. Their relationship, idealized for decades by the media, was built on a paradox. She gave him everything except space. From childhood, Cristian lived under a script written by someone else. Appearances, interviews, career decisions, even family boundaries were shaped by her authority. One of the deepest wounds Cristian has acknowledged is the absence of his father, Manuel El Loco Valdez, not because of abandonment alone, but because of erasure. Cristian has stated that his mother controlled that narrative, limiting contact and withholding truth. For a child growing up in the public eye, that absence became a silent question that no applause could answer. He wanted to please her, to honor her sacrifices, yet he also wanted to understand himself outside her shadow. That tension did not resolve with age. It intensified. Their arguments were not rumors. They were admitted. Cristian has spoken of countless fights, some verbal, some physical, all unresolved. The press often sensationalized these conflicts, portraying Veronica as a victim of her son's volatility. Cristian, however, articulated a different truth. He did not deny her love. He questioned its form. To him, love that controls becomes indistinguishable from domination. Love that prioritizes image over emotional reality leaves scars that do not fade with success. When he married in secret and blocked her communication afterward, the public saw cruelty. Cristian saw survival, a boundary finally enforced. His absence during her medical crises shocked many. A son who does not call, does not send flowers, does not comment. The silence was interpreted as abandonment. Cristian never explained it publicly. Those close to him suggest that his silence was not indifference, but exhaustion. A refusal to re-enter a dynamic where his identity dissolved into her narrative. "I grew up as her project," he once confessed privately, "not as her son." That sentence reframes everything. It transforms conflict into grief. In naming his mother alongside colleagues, Cristian did not equate her with rivals. He acknowledged that the deepest injuries often come from proximity, not opposition. His list, taken as a whole, is not an indictment of individuals, but of relationships that demanded performance at the cost of self. In this second chapter, Cristian Castro emerges not as a man driven by resentment, but as one who has chosen limits over illusion. Limits that may look cold from the outside, but from within, feel like the only remaining form of peace. What gives Cristian Castro's confession its weight is not the shock value of the names, but the timing. At 50, he is no longer speaking from the urgency of a career to be defended or a reputation to be repaired. He is speaking from a place that sits beyond ambition, where the future matters less than coherence with oneself. This is the age when applause loses its power to anesthetize, when success stops functioning as proof, and when unresolved emotional debts demand recognition. Part 3 of this story is not about who hurt him, but about why he chose this moment to stop carrying those injuries in silence. For decades, Cristian's public narrative was shaped by contradiction. He was celebrated as one of the strongest voices in Latin pop, yet ridiculed for his volatility. He sold out arenas, yet his personal life was dissected with a cruelty rarely applied to his peers. In the industry's mythology, he became the archetype of the talented but unstable artist, the one whose emotional openness was reframed as weakness. What his recent words reveal is that this instability was often a reaction to environments that demanded obedience rather than honesty. The list he shared functions less as a confession of hatred and more as an inventory of moments where he chose not to disappear into expectation. The entertainment industry thrives on silence disguised as professionalism. Artists are trained early to absorb disrespect, to normalize imbalance, to interpret discomfort as the price of relevance. Cristian's story exposes how corrosive that culture can be when combined with early fame. A child who grows up performing learns quickly that approval is conditional. Smile correctly. Sing on cue. Be grateful. The cost of deviating from that script is swift and public. Over time, that pressure teaches many artists to internalize conflict, to reinterpret pain as immaturity. Cristian refused that lesson, and for that refusal, he paid in reputation. What makes his confession resonate is the absence of dramatization. He does not exaggerate. He does not reframe himself as a hero. He acknowledges his own rigidity, his unwillingness to negotiate principles. In a culture that prizes adaptability, this rigidity is framed as arrogance. Yet, in his telling, it is survival. He presents a worldview where music is not merely a product, but an extension of character. In such a worldview, compromise is not neutral. It leaves residue. Over time, that residue accumulates into resentment, exhaustion, and self-erasure. The reactions to his words reveal a divided audience. Some interpret his honesty as bitterness, evidence that he cannot let go. Others see it as overdue clarity. This divide mirrors a broader cultural discomfort with emotional boundaries, particularly when they disrupt familiar narratives. The public prefers reconciliation arcs, moments where former rivals embrace on stage, where family conflicts are resolved in soft-focus interviews. Cristian offers none of that. His story resists closure because real wounds often do. By refusing to manufacture forgiveness for the sake of optics, he challenges the expectation that celebrities exist to provide emotional resolution for strangers. Part 3 also reframes the concept of legacy. Traditionally, legacy in music is measured by charts, awards, and longevity. Cristian's confession suggests a different metric: integrity. What remains when the voice ages, when trends shift, when youth is no longer a shield. He is acutely aware that his career will eventually be summarized in lists and retrospectives. By speaking now, he inserts his own narrative into that archive. He ensures that his story is not reduced to caricature, not flattened into gossip. He claims authorship over his emotional history. There is also a quiet warning embedded in his words, directed not at his former colleagues, but at younger artists. The warning is subtle but unmistakable. Do not confuse success with safety. Do not assume that professionalism will protect you from erasure. Learn early to distinguish between collaboration and compliance. Cristian's life illustrates what happens when those distinctions are learned too late. His confession is an attempt to spare others the same accumulation of unspoken compromises. Yet, despite the severity of his tone, there is no call for punishment. He does not ask the public to cancel or condemn anyone. He does not demand apologies. This absence of retribution is crucial. It signals that his objective is not correction of others, but release of self. He names to unburden, not to destroy. In psychological terms, this is the difference between grievance and boundary. Grievance seeks validation. Boundary seeks peace. The most striking aspect of this chapter is how Cristian reclaims silence. For years, silence was imposed on him by contracts, expectations, and family dynamics. Now silence becomes his choice. After naming what hurt him, he retreats again, not into secrecy but into autonomy. He does not embark on a media tour. He does not revisit the topic repeatedly. The act of speaking once is enough. That restraint lends his words gravity. It suggests that he is not trying to control the narrative, only to complete it. In the broader cultural context, Cristian Castro's confession arrives at a moment when public figures are increasingly expected to perform vulnerability. Ironically, this expectation can be just as constraining as the demand for perfection. Vulnerability, when monetized, becomes another role to play. Cristian's approach resists that trend. He does not cry on cue. He does not provide redemption arcs. He speaks plainly, then steps away. This refusal to engage in therapeutic spectacle may be the most radical element of his gesture. Forgiveness is often treated as the final obligation in stories of conflict, especially when the protagonist is a public figure. Audiences expect it as proof of growth, as a moral full stop that restores balance. Yet Cristian Castro's journey suggests something more uncomfortable, that forgiveness is not always the destination, and that peace does not necessarily require reconciliation. In this phase of his life, Cristian does not reject forgiveness outright, but he redefines it. For him, forgiveness is no longer an act directed outward. It is an internal recalibration, a refusal to continue bleeding in silence for the comfort of others. What emerges clearly is that Cristian's greatest struggle has never been hatred, but obligation. Obligation to behave correctly, to remain accessible, to protect legacies that were not entirely his own. From childhood onward, he was expected to embody gratitude, even when the emotional cost was invisible. As he aged, that expectation only intensified. The industry demanded professionalism. The public demanded humility. Family demanded loyalty. Each demand taken alone seemed reasonable. Together they formed a cage. Part 4 is about the moment he stopped mistaking endurance for virtue. Forgiveness, as commonly presented, often benefits the observer more than the injured. It provides narrative closure. It reassures fans that harmony has been restored. Cristian's refusal to stage that closure unsettles many, because it denies the audience emotional resolution. Yet this refusal is precisely where his peace begins. He does not deny that wounds exist. He denies that they must be transformed into public spectacles of healing. By choosing restraint over reconciliation theater, he reclaims ownership of his emotional timeline. There is also a profound difference between forgiving and forgetting, and Cristian makes no attempt to blur that line. Memory for him is not a weapon but a compass. He remembers not to punish, but to orient himself away from patterns that once consumed him. This distinction matters because forgetting would require erasing parts of himself. His volatility, his sensitivity, his intensity are not defects to be corrected. They are evidence of a nervous system that refused numbness. Forgiveness that demands amnesia would be another form of self-betrayal. In this stage of his life, Cristian's idea of peace is deceptively simple. It is the absence of explanation. the freedom to decline without justification, the right to step away from conversations that once drained him. This peace does not announce itself loudly. It looks from the outside like withdrawal. Fewer interviews, fewer collaborations, less visibility. But this reduction is intentional. It reflects a recalibration of value, where presence is no longer measured by frequency, but by alignment. Part 4 also forces a reevaluation of the role of the audience. For decades, fans felt entitled to Cristian's emotional availability. His openness, once celebrated, gradually became expected. When he began withholding access, the reaction was confusion, even resentment. How could someone who built a career on emotional exposure now choose silence? The answer lies in the difference between sharing and surrendering. Cristian spent years surrendering pieces of himself to maintain connection. Silence became the boundary that sharing never provided. This boundary extends to family as well. The cultural narrative surrounding parent-child relationships often frames distance as failure. Cristian's story complicates that narrative. He does not portray separation as cruelty, but as necessity. There are relationships, he implies, that cannot evolve without space. Forgiveness, in those cases, may mean accepting limitation rather than restoring intimacy. It may mean acknowledging love without proximity. This idea is uncomfortable, particularly in cultures that prioritize unity at all costs. Yet it reflects a psychological truth many experience but rarely articulate. Another critical element of this chapter is responsibility. Cristian does not absolve himself. He recognizes that his rigidity, his refusal to adapt, contributed to fractures. But responsibility, in his view, does not require self-erasure. It requires honesty. He accepts that he is difficult. He rejects the notion that difficulty equals wrongdoing. In an industry that rewards compliance, difficulty becomes a form of resistance. Not heroic resistance, but human resistance, imperfect and costly. As his voice has aged, so has his relationship with ambition. Part 4 marks a turning point where ambition no longer dictates worth. Success, once defined by reach and recognition, is now measured by coherence. Does his life align with his values? Does his music still reflect his interior world? If the answer is no, he is willing to walk away. This willingness terrifies industries built on predictability. It also liberates artists who realize too late that longevity without authenticity is a hollow victory. Peace for Cristian is not the absence of pain. It is the absence of pretense. He does not claim to be healed. He claims to be honest. That honesty reshapes his relationship with silence. Silence is no longer something imposed, something endured while others speak for him. Silence becomes an active choice, a space where he does not have to perform recovery or forgiveness on demand. In that silence, his voice paradoxically becomes clearer. That forgiveness is optional. That reconciliation is not a moral obligation. That peace may look like distance rather than reunion. Cristian Castro's journey invites the audience to reconsider their expectations, not just of him, but of all public figures asked to turn private pain into communal catharsis. His refusal does not make him cold. It makes him self-directed. What remains unresolved is not conflict, but curiosity. If peace is no longer tied to approval, what does the next chapter look like? If silence is chosen rather than endured, what kind of voice emerges from it? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They linger. And perhaps that lingering, that discomfort without resolution, is the most honest ending this story can offer. When conflict no longer defines the edges of a life, what remains is identity stripped of reaction. For Cristian Castro, this stage is less dramatic than the ones that came before, yet far more demanding. It requires living without an enemy, without a mirror that reflects only opposition. Part 5 is about what happens when an artist who spent decades pushing against pressure finally stops pushing and begins choosing. Choice, unlike resistance, offers no adrenaline. It offers responsibility. Cristian's identity was forged early in motion. He was always becoming something for someone else. A prodigy for the industry, a symbol for fans, a continuation of a lineage, a promise of success fulfilled in real time. Movement protected him from stillness, and stillness threatened to expose questions he was not yet allowed to ask. Now, with the urgency of proving himself dissolved, Those questions surface naturally. Who am I when no one is asking for a performance? What do I value when applause is optional? What kind of man exists beyond the voice people recognize? This is where many artists falter, because the absence of external demand can feel like disappearance. Cristian approaches it differently. Rather than chasing relevance, he reduces noise. He limits access not out of bitterness, but out of discernment. Not every invitation deserves a response. Not every collaboration aligns with his interior rhythm. This selectivity is not arrogance. It is conservation. Energy once spent negotiating respect is redirected inward, toward coherence. Part 5 also reframes creativity. For years, Cristian's music carried the urgency of validation. Each album was a statement. Each performance a proof. Now creation becomes quieter. Less frequent but more deliberate. He no longer sings to be understood by everyone. He sings to remain legible to himself. This shift alters not only output but intention. Songs no longer aim to conquer charts. They aim to articulate states of being. Loneliness without drama. Desire without performance. Regret without apology. In this phase, identity detaches from public reaction. Praise no longer intoxicates. Criticism no longer wounds. That neutrality is not indifference. It is balance. Cristian understands that opinions fluctuate, but alignment endures. By anchoring himself internally, he reduces the volatility that once defined his public image. What once appeared as instability reveals itself as sensitivity unprotected. With boundaries in place, sensitivity becomes a strength rather than a liability. There is also a notable shift in how he relates to time. Earlier chapters were marked by accumulation. Achievements, grievances, expectations. Part 5 emphasizes subtraction. Fewer roles. Fewer explanations. Fewer entanglements. This subtraction is not loss. It is refinement. He begins to experience time not as a resource to be exploited, but as a space to inhabit. Aging, often framed as decline in entertainment, becomes liberation. With youth no longer demanded, honesty becomes permissible. Identity beyond conflict also requires confronting emptiness without filling it immediately. For Cristian, silence is no longer a threat to relevance, but a medium of reflection. In that silence, memories surface without urgency. He does not rush to resolve them. He allows them to coexist. This tolerance for ambiguity marks maturity. The need to define everything dissolves. Some questions remain unanswered, and that becomes acceptable. Part 5 also introduces a subtle shift in how he perceives love. Love without obligation. Love without hierarchy. Love without performance. Relationships that survive this stage do so because they are voluntary, not inherited or expected. Cristian no longer seeks to be needed. He seeks to be chosen and equally to choose freely. This reciprocity changes the texture of connection. It removes the burden of rescue and replaces it with presence. The industry often mistakes withdrawal for decline. Cristian's withdrawal is strategic. By stepping back, he denies the machinery the opportunity to repurpose him. He refuses to become a legacy act performing nostalgia on demand. If he returns, it is because the return serves expression, not expectation. This autonomy disrupts systems that rely on predictability. It also protects him from becoming a version of himself he no longer recognizes. Identity in this context is not static. It is responsive but not reactive. Cristian allows himself to evolve without explanation. This is perhaps the most radical departure from his earlier life. He does not announce reinvention. He embodies it quietly. The absence of spectacle frustrates those accustomed to narrative arcs. There is no grand comeback, no dramatic reconciliation, no final statement. There is continuity without noise. Cristian Castro stands not as a figure defined by who he opposed or who disappointed him, but by what he chooses to protect. His voice remains, but it is no longer the loudest element of his presence. Integrity becomes audible in restraint. Peace becomes visible in selectivity. Identity, finally, becomes something lived rather than defended. This chapter prepares the ground for what follows, because once identity stabilizes, meaning shifts. The next question is no longer who hurt him or who he is without them, but what his story offers beyond itself. Not as confession but as signal. If you wish, I can continue with part 6, where the focus turns to legacy, not as reputation, but as impact measured in permission given to others to live with less pretense and more truth. Legacy is often discussed as something left behind, a residue of success that others interpret once the voice has faded. For Cristian Castro, legacy is not a monument built from awards or numbers, but a quiet transmission of permission. Permission to speak plainly. Permission to step back without apology. Permission to refuse narratives that no longer fit. In this sense, part 6 is less about how he will be remembered and more about what his choices allow others to imagine for themselves. Cristian's confession disrupted an industry habitually invested in denial. By naming discomfort without theatricality, he exposed how much of celebrity culture relies on silence as a stabilizer. Artists are expected to endure imbalance as proof of professionalism. They are praised for resilience when what is often being rewarded is compliance. Cristian's refusal to continue that performance challenges younger artists to reconsider what they normalize early in their careers. His story suggests that unchecked compromise does not disappear. It accumulates and eventually demands a reckoning. What makes this legacy unusual is its lack of instruction. Cristian does not offer advice. He does not position himself as an example to follow. He simply demonstrates an alternative posture. His posture says that boundaries are not failures of character. They are expressions of self-respect. This distinction is critical in an environment where ambition is frequently weaponized against well-being. The unspoken lesson of his journey is that success achieved at the cost of internal coherence is not sustainable. It may endure publicly, but it corrodes privately. Part 6 also reframes influence. Influence is commonly measured by reach, by visibility, by the ability to shape trends. Cristian's influence operates differently. It functions through absence, through refusal, through the normalization of stepping away without collapse. For artists watching from the margins, his choice signals that withdrawal does not equal irrelevance. It can mean recalibration. In a culture addicted to constant output, this message carries unexpected weight. There is also a generational component to this legacy. Cristian belongs to a cohort that entered fame before conversations about mental health, boundaries, and consent were publicly normalized. Emotional distress was dismissed as eccentricity. Conflict was buried under contracts. His decision to speak later in life reflects the cost of that silence. It also bridges a gap between generations, offering younger performers a vocabulary he did not have when it mattered most. Not as a cautionary tale, but as delayed articulation. Legacy, in this context, becomes relational rather than hierarchical. Cristian does not seek to stand above others. He seeks to stand apart. This separation allows him to influence without dominating. His story resonates not because it is exceptional but because it is familiar. Many recognize the pattern of being shaped into something useful, of being praised for endurance rather than honesty. Cristian's difference lies in his willingness to stop participating in that exchange. Another dimension of this legacy is restraint. In an era where public confession often escalates into content cycles, Cristian's restraint stands out. He did not serialize his pain. He did not monetize revelation. He spoke once and retreated. This restraint restores weight to words. It implies that not everything must be processed publicly to be real. For an industry increasingly reliant on oversharing, this is a countercultural stance. Part 6 also confronts the myth of closure. Audiences often expect stories to conclude neatly, with reconciliation or redemption arcs. Cristian offers neither. His legacy resists tidy endings because life rarely provides them. By leaving tensions unresolved, he affirms that peace does not require consensus. It requires alignment. This reframing liberates both artist and audience from the obligation to agree. As his career enters a quieter phase, Cristian's impact becomes less visible but more durable. It exists in the permission others feel to decline opportunities that compromise them, in the courage to disappoint expectations without self-punishment, in the recognition that stepping back can be an act of authorship rather than surrender. These shifts may never be attributed directly to him, yet they form the most enduring kind of legacy, one that changes behavior subtly without demand. Solitude is often mistaken for defeat, especially in a world that equates visibility with worth. For Cristian Castro, solitude has become something else entirely. Not a retreat born of exhaustion, but a space deliberately chosen after decades of noise. Part 7 examines what remains when the need to explain oneself dissolves, when aging is no longer resisted, and when peace is no longer pursued as an outcome, but practiced as a condition. As the demands of constant relevance loosen their grip, Cristian encounters a version of time he had rarely known before. Time not scheduled, not justified, not monetized. This encounter is unsettling at first. Stillness exposes habits once disguised as momentum. Without the pressure of proving, questions arise quietly. Who am I when no one is watching? What parts of me were formed in response rather than intention? These questions do not arrive with urgency. They arrive with patience. And patience, for someone who spent a lifetime in acceleration, requires relearning. Aging plays a central role here, not as decline but as permission. Youth demanded compliance. Aging allows refusal. The industry often frames aging artists as liabilities unless they reproduce nostalgia. Cristian resists that frame. He does not return to reenact former triumphs. He allows distance to exist between who he was and who he is becoming. This distance is not denial. It is honesty. He understands that trying to remain identical to a younger self is another form of performance, one that drains more than it gives. In solitude, Cristian's relationship with his voice changes. The voice that once needed to fill stadiums now fills rooms, sometimes only internal ones. Singing becomes less about projection and more about resonance. He listens differently, not just to music but to himself. This listening reveals that silence is not emptiness. It is texture. It contains memory, regret, acceptance, and the faint relief of no longer having to negotiate every feeling in public. Part 7 also confronts the fear that often accompanies solitude: irrelevance. Cristian recognizes this fear without obeying it. He understands that relevance, when chased, becomes another cage. When released, it loses its power to threaten. He allows himself to be less discussed, less expected, less consumed. In doing so, he recovers something he lost early: authorship over his own rhythm. Days are no longer measured by output but by alignment. There is a subtle shift in how he experiences connection. Solitude does not eliminate relationship, clarifies it. Those who remain are not bound by obligation or history alone, but by mutual choice. Conversations become fewer but deeper. Presence replaces performance. This recalibration affects how he understands intimacy. Intimacy no longer requires constant access. It requires respect for distance. In this way, solitude becomes relational rather than isolating. Aging also brings reconciliation with imperfection. Cristian no longer attempts to correct the past. He does not seek to repair every misunderstanding or soften every edge. He allows certain narratives to stand unchallenged, even when they misrepresent him. This acceptance is not resignation. It is selectivity. He chooses where to invest energy, knowing that not all perceptions deserve response. Peace emerges not from being understood but from no longer needing to be. In this stage, peace sheds its earlier definitions. It is not harmony. It is not closure. It is not forgiveness performed on cue. Peace is the absence of internal contradiction. The feeling that actions align with values without explanation. That silence is not punishment but rest. That distance is not rejection but clarity. Cristian arrives at this peace gradually, without ceremony. There is no announcement, no statement of arrival. Peace reveals itself in consistency, not declaration. Part 7 also highlights the courage required to age publicly without spectacle. The culture rewards reinvention when it is dramatic. Cristian's evolution is quiet. He does not reinvent. He simplifies. This simplicity unsettles observers accustomed to narrative arcs. There is no comeback to anticipate, no feud to resolve, no apology to demand. There is only continuity shaped by restraint. As solitude becomes familiar, fear recedes. Not entirely, but enough to lose authority. Cristian learns that fear thrives in anticipation, not presence. By inhabiting his days fully, without projecting outcomes, Fear becomes informational rather than directive. Signals but no longer commands. This shift marks maturity not as wisdom accumulated, but as reactivity reduced. In the final stretch of this journey, meaning no longer emerges from struggle, but from continuity. Cristian Castro does not arrive at a grand conclusion or a definitive statement about who he has become. Instead, he settles into a quieter understanding of what it means to live without narration. Part 8 is not an ending in the traditional sense. It is a resting point, where life no longer needs to justify itself through conflict, reconciliation, or reinvention. At this stage, Cristian's relationship with his past changes again. The memories that once demanded interpretation now coexist without explanation. He does not seek to redeem them or transform them into lessons. They simply are. This acceptance marks a profound shift. When life is no longer organized around proving something, meaning becomes less about resolution and more about presence. Cristian does not ask what his story signifies to others. He asks how it feels to inhabit it honestly. Meaning for him becomes relational but indirect. It is found in the way his choices ripple outward without intention. In younger artists who quietly learn that they can say no. In listeners who recognize themselves in the restraint rather than the drama. In the subtle permission granted to age without apology. None of this is claimed or curated. It exists because he stopped managing perception. The absence of management allows authenticity to surface without force. There is also a reconciliation with uncertainty. Earlier chapters were marked by the need to define, to draw boundaries clearly, to name what hurt. Now meaning tolerates ambiguity. Cristian no longer needs to know how everything fits together. He accepts that some relationships remain unresolved, some questions unanswered. This tolerance is not defeat. It is freedom. The freedom to live without demanding coherence from every fragment of experience. In this final phase, music returns to its simplest function. Not as statement, not as identity, but as expression. He sings when he feels moved, not when expected. He records when silence feels insufficient, not when schedules demand it. The voice that once carried the weight of expectation now carries only what it can hold. This lightness does not diminish its power. It refines it. Part 8 also reframes success one last time. Success is no longer cumulative. It is momentary. It exists in days that pass without inner conflict. In conversations that do not require performance. In solitude that feels inhabited rather than empty. Cristian does not measure these moments. He recognizes them quietly. That recognition is enough. There is no farewell embedded in this chapter. No announcement of retreat. No promise of return. Cristian Castro's life does not conclude with closure because closure implies completion. And life continues without needing to be summarized. What concludes instead is the need to be understood on demand. He releases the audience from the expectation of interpretation, and releases himself from the burden of explanation. Meaning in the end is not something he delivers. It is something he allows. It emerges naturally when resistance dissolves. When opposition no longer structures identity. When peace is practiced rather than pursued. This meaning is modest, almost invisible. Yet it endures because it is not dependent on attention.